Hi, this is Ed Driscoll. Welcome to Silicon Graffiti. We're talking today with Jennifer Burns, the author of late 2009's Goddess of the Market, Ayn Rand and the American Right. And Jennifer, thanks for stopping by Silicon Graffiti.
Thanks for having me.
Jennifer, were you surprised at the resurgence in Rand's popularity last year?
To some degree I was, actually. I was really amazed to realize that she is still as alive as ever in American culture. At the same point, I knew that she tended to come in cycles, that she'd been popular in the 30s, late early 40s, popular in the 60s, but I didn't see it coming to the scope and the scale that it has.
How broad of a resurgence was it? Rand seemed to be pretty quickly embraced last year by people who aren't atheists themselves, or who might not be quite as unabashedly free market as she was. Does the distance between 2010 and Rand's death in 1982 make it easier for people to pick and choose which elements of her philosophy they agree with?
I think absolutely. I mean, she was, as I chronicle in my book, incredibly controversial during her lifetime because she was very outspoken. She took no prisoners. She made it very clear that, in particular, she was an atheist, and that was a fundamental part of her philosophy. So I think many of the messages she had about economics, politics, sound more familiar to us today because they've been repeated not only by her but by a whole host of other libertarian and conservative thinkers. So she sounds less radical. She's not around to sort of enforce the parameters and boundaries of her thought. What I've actually seen from the book, though, is not just people interested in politics and economics are being drawn to her. There's a whole readership out there who just has heard her name, knows she's influential, is interested in her books as literature and stories as much as anything else.
Can we talk a bit about Rand's politics in the 1940s? How well formed were they?
So that, I think, is one of the really interesting discoveries I made in my research. I was one of the first scholars given access to the Ayn Rand archives, which hadn't been examined by historians before. And so what I found was it was known that she had been involved in politics. It was known that she had been a volunteer for Wendell Willkie's presidential campaign in 1940. What I was able to unpack was really how involved she was. She was passionate about the Willkie cause, and after he lost, she got, if anything, more passionate about promoting free market ideas. And she wanted to start an organization dedicated to basically providing a home base for people who'd been excited by the Willkie campaign but hadn't found their political candidate yet. She was very involved in this. She basically stopped working on the Fountainhead for more than a year and dedicated herself to political activism. So that hadn't really been examined before or fleshed out, and also how that political experience then found its way into the Fountainhead is something that I really examined for the first time.
In the movie version of the Fountainhead, plenty of modern architecture was featured, at least in the form of models, drawings, and matte paintings. But as Tom Wolfe noted in From Bauhaus to Our House, the original modernists, such as Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, and even Mies van der Rohe in the early 1920s, were pretty hardcore socialists, very far removed from the mindset of Howard Roark. Was Rand aware of this?
You know, Rand really looked at architecture and architectural creation in terms of what the individual brought to it. So her hero was Frank Lloyd Wright, who was more on the sort of anti-government individualist side than the others you cite. That's another interesting piece of her and her relationship to what we would call conservatism more broadly. She loved modern art. She loved modern architecture. She wasn't really fixated on the past. She loved new, exciting, innovative ideas, art forms in all realms of culture. So that really does separate her from conservatives in a lot of ways.
In The Fountainhead, Roark famously dynamited Cortlandt Homes, a public housing project, when it wasn't built to his original specifications. But would the Rand of Atlas Shrugged and onward have approved of government public housing in the first place?
Well, she didn't approve of it even in the Fountainhead, which is part of why you have Roark in there blowing it up. And she, figuring out that scene in the novel is one of the real breakthroughs she made, because she had some political themes she was working with, she had some artistic themes she was working with, she had this whole idea of individualism. She couldn't tie them all together, and when she came to this scene, it allowed her to, as all of her work did, speak to many different levels. So it was a dramatic climax, just considered artistically. It also had a very clear statement that the individual and the individual's creativity takes precedence over any collectivity. And then it had that statement also made in a political fashion by having it be a government-sponsored housing project. So with all of Rand's work, you can look at it as a story, you can look at it as a parable, you can look at it as a moral lesson. It's always working on multiple levels.
But is it safe to say that at some point during the 1940s and early 1950s, Rand veered further to the right, abandoning the Republicans of the time and becoming even more of a libertarian? And that period in the mid-1950s coincided with William F. Buckley founding National Review and creating a modern non-isolationist conservatism.
You know, she had this real sort of love-hate cycle with politicians. So she'd find someone like Wilkie, become extremely excited about them, and then become disillusioned. And she really went through this same process with Goldwater in the 60s. In the 50s, she did not like Eisenhower from the beginning. And it was seeing all of the intellectuals and activists she knew who'd been really in favor of limited government and rolling back the New Deal, seeing them climb on the Eisenhower bandwagon, she thought, these people don't really have principles. They're not like me, they're different. That is one of these breaking points between her and the conservative movement as it became established. So in my book, I really try to bring to light this broader category of the American right and say that it wasn't just the conservative movement, it wasn't just National Review, there were dissenters aplenty, and they were powerful and influential voices like Rand.
Today, many on the right revere John F. Kennedy as a staunch Cold Warrior, particularly in light of the Democratic presidents who followed. But I imagine that Rand's 1962 speech titled "The Fascist New Frontier" must have played as well with liberals as Atlas Shrugged did with the staff at National Review.
Well, she actually had originally planned to publish a book called The Fascist New Frontier. And her publisher, Random House, said, absolutely not. We cannot publish a book with that title. And that became actually the grounds of a breakup between them. She never published with them again. She said, well, you're censoring me. I'm going to go find someone else who will publish it. So she hated Kennedy. And the line from his inaugural speech, ask not what you can do, what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, she thought that was coercive and really emblematic of the coercive nature of the altruist morality. What's interesting is another one of her enemies on the right, Milton Friedman, said about the exact same thing about that quote. So there was a gathering consensus that Kennedy, whatever his positions in foreign policy, was really promulgating the wrong kind of ideas for America domestically.
And within 10 years of that, Rand would also be distancing herself from libertarians.
Absolutely. So that's one of the sort of frustrating things about writing this book and sort of fun things about writing this book. I was trying to set her in context, set her in dialogue with other groups in American history, but she never stays in any category or any place for long, because she's a true individualist forging her own path. That doesn't mean that she wasn't respected and read and listened to by many different people on the ideological spectrum, right and left, but that she herself and her body of thought, it's really hard to categorize. So libertarians are the perfect example. They loved Rand. They looked to her as an inspiration. The early libertarian movement, early libertarian party, I went through the archives, looked at all the letters and newsletters and documents, and they're saturated with objectivist language and Rand language. And then she'd come out and do these speeches at the Ford Hall Forum in Boston and say, libertarians are plagiarists, they're scum. She would attack them in the most violent language. And so it's one of these sort of paradoxes of Rand that even as her ideas spread and became picked up by other people, she was very jealous about them and very territorial. She wanted libertarians to accept all of her ideas, not just some of them.
Ronald Reagan has been quoted as saying, "The person who agrees with you 80% of the time is a friend and an ally, not a 20% traitor." But was Rand someone who assumed you had to buy into 100% of objectivism or nothing?
Yeah, I mean, that quote really brings to light the gulf between her and Reagan. Now, she's an ideologue and an intellectual, not a politician, but compromise was not in her vocabulary. It was a bad word. Compromise would redirect the whole venture. So she looked at people like F.A. Hayek and said, these people are traitors. And she almost hated the Republican who was moderate more than the Democrat or the liberal, because she thought these people pretend to be your friend, and then under the guise of being your friend, they're going to sneak in statist ideas or anti-capitalist ideas or altruist ideas, so you have to be very vigilant against them. Now, that emphasis on purity has kept her ideas somewhat limited in their influence, and it's also, I think, been a handicap for the libertarian movement that looks to her to sort of overcome, because, you know, politics has been described as the art of the compromise, and for Rand, it was hard for her to be effective in politics if she couldn't compromise.
If Kennedy's New Frontier was the equivalent of fascism to Ayn Rand, what would she make of today's left?
Wow, I think she would be saying a lot of the same thing that she repeated in her life. But I think one theme that would really come to the fore is that capitalism has yet to be tried, that we are dealing with the problems of a mixed economy and we're blaming them on capitalism. And before we blame capitalism, we should actually try it in practice. So, she would look at the events of the past few years and see them as validating her ideas rather than undermining them.
And that brings us to the current year. What would Rand think of a year like 2010 and its epic clash between, on one side of the aisle, the free market or relatively free market-oriented Tea Party coalition, and on the other, arguably the most collectivist-minded president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
I think she'd be pretty excited by the Tea Party movement, honestly, because she came to understand that neither political party was really offering a reasonable solution or offering good, valid ideas for America. So I think finding an alternative or seeing an alternative coming to the fore would have been very exciting for her. Other than that, I think she would be saying to her readers and her followers, just keep educating people, keep repeating the fundamentals, and eventually we'll bring others around to our point of view.
Jennifer, is there a website that people can go to if they want to learn more about the book and the research that you put into it?
Well, this book started as my doctoral dissertation, so I began researching in the Ayn Rand archives in Irvine, California. I was the first historian to get in there to look at all these materials, and most of it went into the book, not all of it, and I also was one of the first people to see this material, so I've actually been blogging about it on my website, which is www.jenniferburns.org, and I've been answering questions that people write in about the archives, what I saw, how I put the book together, all that kind of material. It's actually about, I think, up to part 7 now of a blog series called In the Rand Archives. And, Rand's legacy has been very controversial, very contested, and very guarded by her followers. And so there's some new openness coming about today, and people are really interested in what I saw, and I think I'm going to be only the first of many books coming out of this repository.
We've been talking with Jennifer Burns, the author of the 2009 book, Goddess of the Market, Ayn Rand and the American Right, published by Oxford University Press and available from Amazon.com and your local bookseller. Jennifer, thanks for stopping by Silicon Graffiti.
Thank you.
For Silicon Graffiti, I'm Ed Driscoll.